all for coming. I appreciate you being here today. Last week we talked about some techniques that are used in making genetically modified organisms. We'll review those briefly at the beginning, but I put my name on this first slide to remind myself to introduce myself, which I didn't do last time because, of course, I know everybody. But what you might not know is that my field of expertise, when I had one, was plant molecular population genetics. So what that means is I use DNA markers to trace pollen and seed dispersal in bur oaks.
So you yourself are not genetically modified, is that correct?
I myself am not genetically modified. That's correct. But in the course of my research, I did a lot of these techniques for transgenic cloning that we talked about last time. And I know from personal experience that if you take a stretch of DNA from an oak tree and you put it in a bacterium, you get a bacterium. So I'm really comfortable with these technologies. It's not Jurassic Park. It's not even very exciting. And DNA and I have been friends for 25 years. We're not as close as we used to be, but we still exchange Christmas cards. So that's my background, and I just wanted to put it out there that I'm very comfortable with these technologies, which, of course, does influence my attitude. Now, what am I doing wrong? Okay, so moving along. Okay, so let's start with a question. How much of your food has been genetically modified? If we consider all of the genetic modification issues that we talked about last time, how much do you think has been genetically modified?
80%.
Okay, that's pretty good.
90%.
Yeah, almost all of it. So nothing in the grocery is wild except some of the seafood. If we consider all of the things that we talked about last time, selective breeding over the last 11,000 years, transgenic modification over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years or so, which is insertion of a gene from one organism into an unrelated organism. That's usually what GMO refers to. And then we talked about two of the newer techniques, RNA interference, which is just, at this point, apples and potatoes, and CRISPR-Cas9, which is very new, although alert reader Paula Lauer has found that CRISPR-Cas9 was used to stop browning in mushrooms. So there's one thing there. In any case, there's not very much that's wild in the grocery, which is why I think the paleo diet is kind of a hoot. A gluten-free muffin, I don't think so. All right. All right, here's our next question. True or false, most people should avoid gluten because wheat has been genetically engineered for gluten production?
True.
I got one vote for true, one vote for false.
False.
That is totally false. No GM wheat is currently in the food supply. It turns out it is very, very easy to manipulate gluten levels through selective breeding. And why do we manipulate gluten levels? Pastry flour, where you want a delicate, tender product, has low gluten. Breads, sourdough breads that have more of a tough crumb need higher gluten. What gluten does is to trap gases and make the bread rise. Okay. Also, the second part that's false is only people with gluten intolerance really need to avoid gluten. True or false? Increased incidence of gluten intolerance is correlated to increased consumption of GM foods.
False.
No, that one's true. But it's also correlated to an increased availability of organic food and to the rate of obesity. Information literacy tip number 1, correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation. There's a very tight correlation between me getting up and the sun rising a few minutes later. That does not mean that the sun rises because I have gotten up. That's confusing correlation with causation. True or false? Some people without gluten intolerance feel better on a gluten-free diet. That is true, but it's because they stop eating fast foods and processed foods and eat more fruits and vegetables. Evidence is accumulating now that a lot of the inflammatory diseases that are happening are because our diet is full of things that are low in fiber, high in fat, high in sugar, high in salt. That sort of diet makes the bad bacteria, the evil bacteria in your intestine, proliferate, and they outcompete the good bacteria that thrive on a low-fat, high-fiber diet. And those evil bacteria can cause inflammatory diseases of the bowel. All right, how many food crops make up 99% of transgenic GMOs? 127, 53, 14, or 4? 4. Soybeans, 50%. Corn, 30%. Cotton's a food. Yes, cottonseed oil is used as food. 14%. Canola, 5%. And good luck avoiding high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah.
So really, you think about, well, I don't want to eat GMOs. There's 4 things you have to look for: soybean, corn, cotton, canola. That's most of it. But high fructose corn syrup is in frickin' everything. And you know this. Okay, the other 1% are alfalfa, apple, eggplant, papaya, potato, sugar beet, sugarcane, squash. That's the other 1%. Okay, next question. Cheerios now says not made with genetically modified ingredients. How many ingredients did Cheerios have to change to be GMO free?
None.
Probably 0.
Well, actually 1. 1, maybe 2. Cornstarch, sugar, but not the oats. So the main ingredient in Cheerios hasn't been genetically modified. I was watching TV the other day. There's this micro brewmaster saying, our beer is GMO free. Well, of course it is. Barley and hops have not been genetically modified. It's 4 things. So can we just calm down?
So it's a media thing.
It's a total media thing.
And a marketing thing, sorry. Yeah.
Well, in my mind, it's kind of the same thing. All right, how many genes have been inserted in the top 4 plants? 2, 12, 23, or 5? What do you think? 2. Number 1, glyphosate resistance. Glyphosate interferes with an essential plant enzyme. Humans do not have this pathway. What's the marketing name for glyphosate? Anybody know? Roundup. It's Roundup. This is Roundup Ready. Okay? So the glyphosate, the Roundup interferes with an essential plant enzyme. We don't have that enzyme. We don't have that pathway. So it really is very safe. There's some hype about farmers getting lymphoma after all this time using Roundup. I can tell you, my grandparents and uncle were farmers. Roundup isn't the only chemical they're using. So this was pretty safe. The tolerance, the glyphosate tolerance, is conferred by introducing 1 bacterial gene that produces a similar enzyme in a form that's not disrupted by the glyphosate because it's from bacteria and not from a plant. Therefore, the Roundup Ready can tolerate the Roundup because it has this similar but different enzyme. The other one is Bt toxin. And that's a gene from Bacillus thuringiensis, which is where the Bt comes from, and that produces a protein that is poisonous to only soft-bodied caterpillars and some insects. And as I mentioned last time, if you want to know if this is safe for human consumption, ask yourself, am I a soft-bodied caterpillar?
Was at one time.
Maybe. So if you don't molt, Bt is not going to be a problem for you. Okay, so this is a review from last time. This is just general basic genetics. DNA makes RNA, which makes protein. So DNA basically makes protein. That's what it does. The tricky part is which parts of the DNA get made into protein in various cells. RNA, there's some RNAs that directly regulate DNA and some proteins regulate DNA, but a lot of what goes on in the cell is from these enzymes, like the enzyme for the glyphosate resistance. Now, existing transgenic organisms only have 1 or a few inserted genes, and the outcome of that transgenic manipulation is a protein that has desired functions. This is the pathway that opium poppies use to produce morphine and codeine, which are down here. I counted this up this morning. From here, which isn't the beginning, if we wanted the beginning, which would be carbon dioxide, we'd have to put in a whole pathway for photosynthesis and then some to get to L-DOPA. There's 15 enzymes between here and morphine. So a lot of complicated biomolecules are the end result of these complicated pathways, and each enzyme here is a protein from a different gene. So these products are not going to be easy targets for transgenic manipulation. If we wanted to engineer marigolds so that they would produce morphine, which is an important pharmaceutical. If you've ever had major surgery, you love morphine. I know I do. But it would be very, very difficult to put all of these genes in an organism to get it to function in this pathway. So if we wanted to get more codeine or morphine, we could just look at this part, and our genetic engineering target would be to manipulate things in the organism, in the opium poppy that already makes this stuff. So for example, you could modify poppies to have a higher CODM. And if this CODM is here, it changes thebaine to oripavine, and it's also down here, and that is a straight line to morphine, and it's also down here changing codeine to morphine. So if we modified poppies so they had more of this, we would get more of that. If we wanted more codeine, we could block this, and we would get more codeine. So those would be single gene manipulations that would skew the production of one molecule or another. But to put this whole pathway into something that doesn't happen makes my head swim. And this picture makes me crazy, because this is the embodiment of ignorance and fear-mongering about genetically modified organism. Getting corn to grow a fish head would involve inserting a vast number of genes and getting them all to turn on in the correct sequence for the right amount of time. This would be extraordinarily improbable. And the only reason I'm putting it that way is a biologist never says never. So there's some polarization about this whole thing, and I'm kind of going to go through the two camps. I'm limiting what I'm talking about today basically to plants, because animals are, I've got 30 minutes, you know, so we're not getting into animals much today. Camp number one is GMOs are absolutely necessary to feed a growing human population. Maybe some of you have played the icebreaker game, two truths and a lie. In this statement, I see two lies and a truth. So fallacy number one is that the Earth can support an infinite number of humans. So we're going to have a little ecology lesson. Remember, I'm an ecologist. I'm a plant ecologist. Every population has what we in ecology call a carrying capacity. And that is the population size that can be supported by the environment. When the population reaches carrying capacity, growth must stop. It must. There are more organisms than the environment can support. There are some control factors that kick in automatically as population size increases. So as the population gets bigger, the effect of these things is stronger. One is that resources run out. In human terms, that would be starvation. Another thing is homelessness. Animals run out of nesting sites or places to hide or room to grow if they're plants. Diseases and parasites. The larger the population, the easier it is to transmit diseases and parasites. And also, whether you're a plant or you're an animal, if you're crowded, you are stressed. And stressed organisms get sick faster. And there's predators. If there's more kills, they make more babies. In human terms, I think of that as being war. So as resources run out, warfare will increase. I can almost guarantee this. So we are extremely adept at killing one another, and we spend a lot of resources making ever better technologies for doing that. Fallacy number two is that GMOs, as they are currently produced, feed humans. This is how corn is used. 39% goes to biofuels. 37% goes to animal feed. 13% is exported. 11% is actually eaten by us in this country. Here's the big lie of corn ethanol. Corn is the most petroleum-intensive crop that we grow. And what that means is that it takes 1 gallon of petroleum for every 1.3 gallons of corn ethanol that's produced. It is hugely inefficient. 4.7% of corn in this country is made into high fructose corn syrup, and 90% of that goes to beverages. I would argue that this is not food. And that leaves 6.3% for things like cornflakes, masa, tortillas, polenta, cornmeal, that stuff. So corn is not really feeding human beings as we grow it. What about soy? Soybeans are squished to make meal and extract the oil. Of that meal, 98% goes to animal feed. 2% goes for humans. Oil, 80% is used for human consumption, mostly in fast food fryers, and 12% is used as biofuel. My question, do we need to eat all that soybean oil? Okay, here's the truth. GMOs can help feed the world. We could have increased yield with decreased pesticide and fungicide use through engineered resistance, like the BT. Nutrient enhancement of common foods to fight malnutrition. This has not been a stunning success. For example, corn does not have complete amino acids. There are 20 amino acids. 8 of them are essential to human beings because we can't make them, so we have to get those particular 8 building blocks from our food. Corn is missing maybe 1, and it was engineered so that it would have complete protein, and the people didn't like it. Changed the texture, so it was no longer palatable. So there's some issues surrounding that. This could be really important as climate change gears up, and that is drought and salt tolerance. The climate, because we've been dumping so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the climate is changing. There will be shifting precipitation patterns, and these are going to happen on a much faster time scale than is natural. And if we could genetically engineer crops for drought resistance, we could get around those years and years and years that it takes to selectively breed these things. But for this to happen, the focus of the research has to shift from the producers, where it has been, think of Monsanto, to the consumers. That is happening. We hear a lot about Monsanto because they had the patent for the Roundup until it expired. They made the Roundup Ready crops. It was a neat little system. They made a ton of money. And a lot of what went on there is about corporate greed. But there are universities and nonprofits that are working on some of these other things, but they don't get the press because they're not as big. Last time I talked about golden rice. Golden rice has vitamin A to prevent eye disease in children. But then there's this ethical thing that goes on here. Is the real problem that there's so many children that are so poor that they have nothing but rice to eat. In fact, and urbanization is a problem here too, because if you ate the weeds that grow around the rice paddy, you'd have more vitamin A than you possibly could need. So as urbanization has happened, traditional foodways have changed so that people are eating single things instead of that diversity of things that they used to eat. So there's lots of things that go along with this that can't be fixed with technology. All right, here's the other camp is that GMOs are innately evil. They poison our food. Our own genes can be contaminated by GMOs, and they ruin our environment. There's more, but I tried to cut this down to be manageable. All right, so next question. How long have transgenic GMOs been in the food supply? 5, 10, 15, 20, or 30 years? Not quite 30, 20. 20 years. So as I look out on my students, I realize they have been eating GMOs their entire life. True or false? A large body of evidence suggests that GMO food is no more hazardous than non-GMO food. That is true. That is totally true. The primary risk of either is an allergic response in a small proportion of people. All right, information literacy tip number 2. Sensational discoveries make headlines, retractions do not. If you do a Google image search for GMOs, this rat will come up. In 2012, French researchers reported that rats fed GMOs developed tumors. This paper made a big splash. It was immediately discredited because they used rats that were specifically bred to grow tumors. You could have fed this rat organic tofu and it would have gotten a tumor. And they also used bad statistics. The paper was then retracted from a reputable journal, and they found another journal to produce it, or magazine or something, so it is still out there. But in fact, this was bad science, but we don't hear about the retractions. Remember when aluminum caused Alzheimer's? Who remembers that? Yeah, that paper got retracted too. How about the one? Hey, this one has been called the most dangerous scientific hoax of the last century. Vaccines cause autism. Intentional scientific fraud. It was retracted, the guy's medical license was pulled, he got in a world of hurt, and people still think it's true. Most dangerous scientific hoax of the century. Okay. True or false, you can acquire transgenes from your food or from eating animals that have been fed GM food.
False.
That is false. You get your genes from A, your mom and dad, and B, viral infections. That's really the only things that can get DNA into your cells. And most of these are not permanent. When your cells get viruses, your immune system removes them. Okay, what happens to your food? So when we eat carbohydrates like sugar and starch, that gets changed into energy. When we eat lipids, it gets changed into energy, or stored if we eat too much of it. When we eat proteins, it's broken down into building blocks. It's building blocks of amino acids. And then we make it into our own proteins. The same thing happens with DNA. It's broken into nucleotides, and then we put it together in our own DNA according to our own instructions. Genetically modified proteins are tested specifically for breakdown during digestion prior to release. So we had a question last week about the modified salmon that has extra growth hormones. I looked it up. There's two kinds of hormones in the world. There's protein hormones like insulin and growth hormone that have to be, if you're on those therapies, you have to inject it because your digestive system will just break it down. There's also fat-soluble proteins like steroid proteins, and those you can take orally. Anyway, so the transgenes get chopped up and made into your own DNA. The transgenes in animal feed have been made into animal DNA before you eat the animal. Okay, so really, to say that GMOs cause cancer, I can't understand how that mechanism will work. I don't know everything. I put that right out there. A biologist never says never, but I can't see a mechanism by which that would happen. Okay. The real problem of GMOs aren't really about GMOs. It's about bad farming. It's bad farming practices. And there has been environmental damage because of GMOs. Overuse of one herbicide, the Roundup, has led to widespread resistance in weeds. You use the same thing over and over and over, you are asking for it. This is evolution in action. This is selection. You're putting a huge selective pressure on those weeds, so that any weed that has a mutation that makes it resistant will grow and reproduce, and that's going to spread through the population. Glyphosate is relatively safe. The replacement herbicides that are being looked at now to replace it are a lot nastier. It's too bad. This arms race of herbicide use and herbicide resistance in weeds is not unique to GM plants. It's been going on since herbicides were first used. Why were herbicides first used? Because of soil erosion. So there's long stories to all of this, but in brief, when I was a kid, the new big ecologically way of farming was no-till. Remember no-till? Because soil erosion was such a huge problem. Farmers plowed after they harvested, they plowed again in the spring all winter long. The soil is washing away, it's blowing away, huge problems with soil erosion. So no-till came in and they didn't plow, but they had to still control. So they just spray herbicide and leave the weed roots in place over the winter so that they would hold the soil. So we solve one problem, we cause other problems. Overplanting of Bt crops in the same way puts huge selection pressure on the insects. So that selects for Bt resistance in pests. Bt is one of the few pesticides that are approved for organic farming, and it's rapidly becoming less effective. The other argument is the Bt crops may harm non-target species, which could be true, but it's not true for the monarch, which got all the press. 1999, there was this study that showed that Bt corn pollen was toxic to monarchs. Two years later, another study showed that it's only toxic in levels much higher than are found in nature. Basically, monarch caterpillars do not like corn pollen. They won't eat corn pollen unless they are force-fed it in a lab where there's nothing else to eat. And they don't do well on it. Whether it's Bt or not, any corn pollen is not good for monarchs. The real problem is the overuse of glyphosate has pretty much wiped out milkweeds. There used to be lots of milkweeds around cornfields, not anymore. And let's talk about monoculture. Here's a picture that I took of the field across the road from my house. In fact, going in today, I was almost taken out of this world by a tractor with a sprayer that was as wide as the road. They're out there now spreading ammonia like crazy, which takes a huge amount of petroleum to produce that ammonia, by the way. So we've got this monoculture thing going on, which is high concentrations of closely related individuals, namely corn for acres and acres and acres of corn. Big sprayers to spray all those acres of corn. Another ecology lesson, natural systems are diverse. Interactions of different plant species and a multitude of soil organisms renew the soil nutrients naturally. Different plant species have different natural defense chemicals. Diseases and parasites are limited by low transmission rates and less stressed hosts. And herbivores are limited by food supply and predators. So these herbivores are going to be able to eat some of these plants and not others because they'll be sensitive or resistant to various natural protection mechanisms. Now, nature views these industrial monocultures as populations at carrying capacity. Starvation, we have decreases in essential soil nutrients by rotating the same two crops. So corn, soy, corn, soy, corn, soy. The soy does put some nitrogen back in the soil. The corn takes more than they put out. New diseases and parasites can quickly sweep the entire crop. And if you think it's a problem in a cornfield, think about 10,000 chickens in a pole barn. Insect herbivores can quickly multiply because their food supply is virtually unlimited and the predators can't reproduce quickly enough. Think about birds that have maybe 1 or 2 fledglings, crop of fledglings a summer. Insects reproduce much faster than that. Their predators can't catch up, so that allows them to get the jump on it. Industrial agriculture also decreases diversity in crop plants. So when white folks first came to this country, Native Americans grew dozens of varieties of dent corn, sweet corn, popcorn, flour corn, flint corn, and pod corn. 99% of US corn is dent corn, and we flood the world with it. We not only flood with the corn itself, but we also are trying to push our Roundup Ready corn on the rest of the world. Monsanto is always looking for markets. I think it was when NAFTA first went through, cheap US corn flooded Mexico, and people who had been growing their native corn that was adapted to their local conditions and saving seeds year after year, they went out of business. And a lot of that germplasm was lost. Seed saving doesn't mean you're going to put the seeds in an envelope and stick them in a drawer. They don't last forever. They have to be planted periodically to keep that line going, because the germination rate will go down as they're stored. They get too dry, they get too whatever. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about bananas, because this is the price of fear. Bananas we eat are naturally sterile. They became sterile about 7,000 years ago by having 3 copies of every chromosome instead of 2, which means they really can't, long story. So all of our bananas are not just genetically similar, they are genetically identical. Identical. Every single banana is identical. These are Cavendish. The Gros Michel has already gone extinct from Panama disease. That would happen in the 50s. So a disease that kills one will kill them all. Traditional selective breeding of bananas is really hard because seedlessness is a desired trait. So you want them to be sterile. So to try to cross them with a seeded banana, which exist, in traditional crossbreeding there's about 1 seed in 10,000 bananas. In the 1970s, black sigatoka began spreading among bananas in Africa. Most of these bananas are grown on small family plots, and they are a major source of food. Now, in the 1990s, millions of Africans in Rwanda and Burundi were displaced by ethnic warfare. 1995, Ronnie Swennen, who was then at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and he had actually figured out a way by manipulating conditions and time of day of pollination and so forth to really up the number of seeds he could get from bananas. So he had 21 new banana varieties, which were from his enhanced selective breeding, that were resistant to black sigatoka. But he had to fight for 2 years to get field trials in Tanzania. And that's because at the same time, Monsanto was trying to get Bt corn and Bt soy approved in Tanzania. And so this whole banana thing got tied up in that because people would just had this fear. And millions of refugees are starving, and he's got these bananas that he wants to put out in Africa, and he can't do it because people are just afraid without understanding what's at stake. Once the trial started, the farmers snuck in during the night and stole bananas out of the test plots because they were hungry. As the test proceeded then, and this was a really good example of how modified organisms should be introduced, the farmers were brought in to select the ones that they liked, that they thought would grow in their local conditions. And this was all nonprofit. This was supported by the university. And they were just given away for free on the condition that they would share them with their neighbors. So this was a kind of a success story. And really, for things like this, GM bananas offer the best hope for resistance to a variety of old and emerging diseases because they're really hard to breed. So here's my conclusions. I'm running over. GMOs are neither all good nor all bad. They have the same goal as traditional selective breeding, but the results are much faster. This can be particularly important for crops that are seedless or take a long time to mature. GMOs do have a place in the conversation about sustainable agriculture, but we need to use more than 2 genes. And we particularly, even with transgenic stuff, we need to be sure we're saving all the genetic diversity left so we've got something to pull genes from. In not only crop plants, but related non-crop plants. So the Swennen guy has collected 1,200 varieties of bananas. Most of them are not good to eat. And the most important change, as I see it, is to stop treating farms like factories and let ecological principles inform our food growing practices. The end.